What can you actually accomplish in 6 hours? Think about it for a second. You could watch a long director's cut of a movie. You could take a slightly extended afternoon nap. You could drive from one major city to another. Or, if you were the German army in April 1940, you could use that same window of time to conquer an entire sovereign nation. Welcome back to Paul's Chronicles. I'm Paul, and today we are looking at a military record that remains one of the most surreal, confusing, and debated moments in the history of human warfare. On April 9th, 1940, the citizens of Denmark woke up in a peaceful, neutral kingdom. They went about their morning routines, brewing coffee and heading to work, believing they were safe behind the shield of international law. But by the time they were sitting down for their lunch breaks, they were no longer living in a free country. They were living in an occupied territory. There were no epic sieges like in the movies. There were no months of brutal trench warfare like in the Great War. There were no heroic last stands that lasted for weeks on end. Instead, the world witnessed 6 hours of absolute, clinical, and terrifying efficiency. But how did this happen? How does a nation with a proud, ancient history of Viking warriors and a modern, well-equipped army simply stop? Was it an act of cowardice? Or was it the most cold-blooded, realistic decision ever made by a king to save his people from total, irreversible annihilation? Before we dive into the fastest invasion in the history of warfare, I have a quick but vital request. We are building something special here at Paul's Chronicles, an archive of the moments time tried to forget, and your support is exactly what keeps these deep dives going. If you are fascinated by the hidden corners and the what-ifs of World War II, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now and turn on all notifications. Also, smash the like button if you think a 6-hour war sounds more like a dark comedy sketch than a real chapter in a history book. It really helps the algorithm show Paul's work to more history seekers like you. And stay tuned until the very end, because the way the Danish people chose to resist after the surrender is a story of quiet bravery that you've probably never heard in school. Let's get into the strategic madness of Operation Weserübung. To truly understand why Hitler set his sights on this tiny, flat, and peaceful land, we have to look far beyond the borders of Denmark itself. We need to zoom out and look at the cold, calculating map of Northern Europe in 1940. More importantly, we have to talk about the one thing the German war machine couldn't survive without: iron. You see, Germany had a massive, glaring weakness. Its modern tanks, its heavy artillery, and its vast fleet of ships were all hungry for high-quality iron ore. And over 50% of that iron came from just one place: Sweden. During the warm summer months, this vital ore was shipped safely through the Baltic Sea, a body of water that Germany controlled like its own backyard. But winter changed everything. When the Baltic waters froze solid, the iron couldn't move by boat. Instead, it had to be transported by rail across the mountains to the Norwegian port of Narvik. From there, it would be shipped down the long, jagged coast of Norway, staying within neutral waters to avoid the British Navy. It was a lifeline, but it was a fragile one. In London, Winston Churchill and the British High Command weren't blind to this. They knew that if they could cut this single artery, Hitler's factories would go silent, and his panzers would eventually grind to a halt. The British were already drawing up aggressive plans, known as Plan R4, to mine Norwegian waters and potentially even land troops to block these shipments. Hitler, fueled by his characteristic paranoia, couldn't sit and wait for the Allies to strike first. He decided he had to seize Norway to secure his iron. But there was a massive logistical nightmare. The German Navy was tiny compared to the British Royal Navy. They couldn't hope to challenge the British for control of the seas for very long. To invade Norway effectively, Germany needed a stepping stone. They needed airfields that were close enough to the action to provide constant air cover for their ships and troops. If they tried to fly from Germany, the distance was too great. But if they could take Denmark, they would have the perfect platform. Denmark was geographically essential, but it was also a defender's nightmare. It is a flat country with no mountains to hide in, no deep forests to mount a long-term guerrilla defense, and almost no natural barriers to slow down a modern army. To a German tank commander, Denmark wasn't a country, it was a highway. However, Hitler didn't just want a battlefield. He wanted what he called a model protectorate. He looked at the lush Danish countryside and saw something else: food. He wanted Danish farms to act as a giant pantry to feed his millions of soldiers with butter, bacon, milk, and grain. He wanted a silent, efficient occupation where the Danish government would keep the lights on and the trains running while the German military used the land as a giant, unsinkable aircraft carrier. As the sun began to rise on the morning of April 9th, the Danish people were about to realize that in the eyes of the Wehrmacht, their neutrality was nothing more than a historical curiosity. Their peace was about to be sacrificed on the altar of German industrial necessity. The planning for the invasion of Denmark, known by its German codename Operation Weserübung, was unlike anything the world had ever seen in the history of warfare. It wasn't just about overwhelming an enemy with sheer numbers. It was a masterpiece of deception, synchronization, and cold-blooded strategy. The German High Command knew that a traditional, loud invasion might give the Danish government enough time to destroy their vital infrastructure, or, worse, allow the British Royal Navy to intervene. To prevent this, they turned to a tactic as old as history itself, the Trojan horse. Days before the first shot was even fired, the operation began in total silence. Massive German coal freighters, ships that looked like ordinary, grimy merchant vessels, began to steam into Danish ports. To any observer on the docks, these were just typical cargo ships bringing fuel to the city. But deep within their dark, hollow hulls, the reality was terrifying. Hidden behind false walls and beneath the coal dust were hundreds of German soldiers, elite units fully armed, and waiting in the cramped, stifling darkness for the signal to emerge. These men were living in a state of suspended animation, knowing that if they were discovered, they would be trapped in a floating metal coffin. This was the pinnacle of military risk. While these Trojan ships were positioning themselves in the heart of Danish cities, specialized motorized units were moving toward the border under the thick, protective cover of night. The Germans were obsessed with the clock. They knew that if they could capture the Danish airfields in the very first hour of the invasion, the war would be over before the king could even finish his morning coffee. The airfields at Aalborg, located in the far north of the Jutland Peninsula, were the crown jewel of the entire operation. Without them, the invasion of Norway, happening simultaneously, would fail. But before we see the hatch of those ships open, I want to take a moment to speak to you directly. We are uncovering the layers of a conflict that changed the world forever, and your engagement is what allows Paul's Chronicles to keep digging through these dusty archives. If the audacity of this German Trojan horse plan surprises you, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. We are on a mission to bring these overlooked stories to life. And while you're at it, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that this kind of deep historical storytelling matters. Now, let's get back to the moment the silence of the night was shattered forever. On the morning of April 9th, at precisely 4:15 a.m., the German war machine finally lurched into motion. German troops poured across the land border at Schleswig, catching the Danish border guards in a state of total shock. But the real revolution in warfare was happening above them. This morning marked the first time in human history that paratroopers, the elite Fallschirmjäger, were used in actual combat to seize strategic objectives. These soldiers didn't just jump, they descended like ghosts through the pre-dawn mist. Their primary targets were the bridges and, most importantly, the Aalborg airfields. The Danish soldiers guarding these points heard the roar of engines before they saw the planes. Within minutes, hundreds of white parachutes bloomed in the sky. The Danish defenders were brave, but they were facing a type of warfare they hadn't even imagined in their training. By the time the sun had fully cleared the horizon, the vital stepping stone to Norway was firmly in German hands. The clock was ticking, and Denmark was already losing the race against time before most of its citizens had even opened their eyes. I want to hear from you in the comments below. Do you think this level of deception is a brilliant military move? Or is it a violation of the rules of war that makes it harder for nations to trust each other even today? Your comments help build the community here, and I make it a point to read through them. As the paratroopers secured the north, the focus shifted back to Copenhagen, where the Trojan ships were about to deliver their lethal cargo. As the German columns lurched across the border at exactly 4:15 in the morning, the Danish army found itself in a position that can only be described as a strategic nightmare. Most of the soldiers were young, fresh-faced conscripts who had spent more time training with shovels than with heavy weaponry. The order to mobilize had been tragically delayed because the government in Copenhagen was paralyzed by fear that any sudden movement would be seen as a provocation by Hitler. It was a classic case of hoping for the best while the worst was already knocking on the door. When the first shots rang out in the pre-dawn mist, the scene was chaotic, desperate, and tragically lopsided. In the south of Jutland, near the border, small Danish anti-tank units managed to stage a series of sharp, brief, and incredibly brave stands. Despite being vastly outnumbered, they managed to knock out several German armored cars and even a few light tanks. They were proving to the world that they were willing to fight for their sovereignty, even if the odds were astronomical. There's a famous, heartbreaking image from this morning that has become a symbol of the entire invasion. A group of Danish soldiers on bicycles pedaling furiously toward the front lines to face German panzers. Imagine that for a moment. No heavy transport, no massive tank support. Just young men on two wheels, clutching their rifles, heading toward a wall of modern steel. It was the 19th century meeting the 20th century in the most brutal, uncompromising way possible. It was a clash between an era of peaceful neutrality and the new age of total, industrialized war. In the town of Haderslev, a group of Danish soldiers barricaded themselves in their barracks. They refused to listen to the confusing rumors that their government might already be giving up. Instead, they set up machine guns and opened fire, holding back a far superior German force for precious minutes. Their defiance was a spark of pride in an otherwise collapsing front. But while these small isolated pockets of resistance were fighting for every meter of Danish soil, the real, fatal blow was being struck in the very heart of the nation's power. In the harbor of Copenhagen, the coal ships we mentioned earlier finally performed their lethal transformation. The hatches were thrown open, and instead of fuel, hundreds of elite German soldiers poured out onto the docks of Langelinie. They were just a few hundred meters away from the royal palace of Amalienborg. The capital of a sovereign kingdom was being captured not by a siege from the outside, but by an infection from within. King Christian X was woken up by the sharp, rhythmic crack of gunfire and the terrifying, low-altitude roar of German Heinkel bombers circling over the city's historic spires. These bombers weren't just a psychological threat. They were carrying overtures, propaganda leaflets dropped from the sky that gave the Danish people a horrific choice: surrender immediately or watch as your capital is turned into a smoking ruin. The king, a man known for his calm and stoic nature, looked out his palace window and saw German soldiers marching through his own streets. The royal guards at the palace gates, faithful to their duty, opened fire, wounding several Germans in a brief but intense skirmish. But the situation was fundamentally hopeless. The heart of Denmark had been pierced before the rest of the country even knew the war had started. I want you to think about that feeling of total, sudden loss. If this story of the bicycle soldiers and the Trojan ships moves you, make sure to leave a like on the video. It helps Paul keep these chronicles alive for those who seek the reality of the past. It ensures that the bravery of these men, who faced tanks with nothing but rifles and bicycles, is never forgotten. And if you have your own thoughts on this kind of lightning warfare, tell us in the comments. Does speed always win, or is it the spirit of the soldiers that matters most? Let's keep the discussion going. Now, as the king stands in his palace listening to the demands of a conqueror, the clock is reaching its final, decisive hour. The survival of an entire people is hanging by a thread, and the decision is no longer in the hands of the soldiers on the border. It is in the hands of one man. By 5 a.m., while the pre-dawn light was still gray and cold over the Baltic, the political execution of Denmark was already in its final stages. The German ambassador, Cecil von Renthe-Fink, arrived at the door of the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs with a document that would change the course of history. He wasn't there to negotiate. He was there to deliver a death sentence to Danish independence. The ultimatum was framed in a way that was as cynical as it was terrifying. Renthe-Fink claimed that the German army had occupied Denmark not as an enemy, but as a protector. He spun a web of lies, claiming that the British were on the verge of invading, and that Hitler had graciously stepped in to save the Danish people. The demand was simple and brutal. All resistance must stop immediately. No more firing at the border, no more skirmishes at the palace, no more attempts to defend the airfields. If the Danes refused to cooperate, the consequences would be catastrophic. The Luftwaffe, the most feared air force in the world at that time, was already in the air. Hundreds of bombers were idling over the city, their bays filled with high explosives. The threat was explicit. If the surrender wasn't signed, Copenhagen, with its centuries of culture, its wooden houses, and its 500,000 civilians, would be turned into a smoking graveyard. Hitler was ready to make an example out of Denmark, just as he would later do to the cities of Rotterdam and Warsaw. Inside the palace, King Christian X sat in an emergency session with his cabinet and his top military commanders. The room was thick with a sense of suffocating panic. The news from the front lines was a series of rapid-fire disasters. The border was gone. The airfields were lost. The Navy was trapped like a wounded animal in the harbor. The Danish generals were honest with their king. They could fight on. They could retreat into the rural areas and hold out for a few more hours, maybe even a few days if they were lucky. Но за это время тысячи молодых датчан погибнут зря, а столица будет стерта с лица земли. King Christian was a tall, proud man, often seen riding his horse through the city as a symbol of the nation's dignity. He loved his country with a quiet intensity, but he was also a cold-blooded realist. He looked at the maps, he listened to the roar of the German engines overhead, and he understood the math of modern war. Denmark was too small, too flat, and too isolated to win a conventional war against the most powerful military machine on the planet. To fight on wasn't an act of bravery. In his eyes, it was an act of national suicide. He had to choose between the pride of a soldier and the survival of a people. At precisely 8:34 a.m., less than 5 hours after the first German boot touched Danish soil, the decision was made. The order was broadcast across the country to cease fire. The Danish government had officially capitulated. By 10 a.m., the German occupation was complete. The 6-hour war had ended before many Danes had even finished their breakfast. I want you to pause for a second and try to wrap your head around that timeline. Imagine going to work at 8 a.m. in a free country, and by your first coffee break, your nation has been erased from the map of independent states. If you find this speed as haunting as I do, make sure to smash that like button. It's the best way to support Paul's Chronicles and ensure we can keep exploring these moments where the world tilted on its axis. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. We are building an archive of the truth, and every new subscriber helps us keep the lights on in the library of history. But as the guns fell silent and the German soldiers began to set up their checkpoints, a new and much stranger chapter was about to begin. The surrender wasn't the end of Denmark. It was the start of a unique, silent struggle that would baffle the German occupiers for years to come. Because, as we're about to see in our final part, while the Danish body had been occupied, the Danish spirit was preparing a very different kind of war. The aftermath of the 6-hour war was unlike anything else in World War II. Because Denmark surrendered so quickly, Hitler treated it as a model protectorate, leading German soldiers to nickname it the Cream Front, because life there was so easy compared to the horrors of the East. But the Danish spirit remained unbroken. King Christian X became a symbol of silent defiance, riding his horse through the streets of Copenhagen every day without a single bodyguard, right past the German patrols. Later, the Danish people would execute one of the most heroic acts of the war, smuggling nearly their entire Jewish population to safety in Sweden. The 6-hour war was a crushing military defeat, but it was a masterstroke of national survival. Was it a smart move of realism or a stain on their history? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more hidden stories from the archives, make sure to subscribe and like the video. Thank you for supporting Paul's Chronicles. This is Paul, the man in the helmet and the mustache, signing off. Stay in the shadows until next time.